Just a quick little bit about me. So I've been in product management since around 2013. I will go on to some of my roles before Fintech, but I started my career working at L'Oreal and then went on to work at Sainsbury's. And I suppose my journey into Fintech was when I first started working at Barclays around 4 years ago. And I guess most recently, about just under a year ago, I moved into Metro Bank. So at the moment, I'm head of product, or head of mobile, sorry. So I look after their mobile channels. So I look after around about 4 to 5 teams, feature teams, so developers, UI, and so on, and then work very much with product managers across the business as well. So that's just a little bit about me. A little bit about Metro Bank. So any Metro Bank customers in the room? Oh, great, that's pretty good. Right, so 3 in about 30, great. So about 10% of you. So just a little bit on Metro Bank. Just want to give you a feel for where I am now and what we do. So Metro Bank launched in 2010. It was kind of one of the first new banks in over 100 years. So I think for me, it's kind of paved the way for a lot of the banks. Some of them are literally across the road. I suppose it's always been about service, always been about meeting the customer needs. So we've got the app here, which I'm really proud of. And we've always been quite innovative and customer-led. So we're open 7 days a week. The app's got 4.8 stars in the App Store, which I'm really proud of. And then we've done some innovative stuff like you can block your card anytime. And I suppose digital is a huge part of what we're offering alongside other channels, sort of in terms of online banking, mobile banking, stores, as well as calling up and asking for help. So that's just a little bit about Metro Bank and me. Cool, so brings us on to tonight's topic. So what is product management in Fintech? So anyone that wasn't expecting that, sorry, maybe it's another day. And I suppose the things that I just want to cover, and I'm going to cover these at a high level. A lot of you put your hands up in terms of, obviously you're here, you've heard a bit about product management. So I'm just going to touch on what is product management, and that's not my textbook version, it's kind of my version. So whenever I come to these events, it's great to understand kind of the textbook version, but you kind of generally want to hear what's that person's journey been, what's their views on what a good product manager is. And it's not one size fits all, everyone wants to bring their own personality. I think product management is a space where you can be yourself, you can really bring your own sort of experience to it. What is Fintech? So I think you're all in a great place. You just walk around the corner, you're basically in Fintech. I'm sure there's some Fintechs here. Some of you are already working at them there. So I just want to give you my spin on that. Being a good Fintech product manager, what does that look like? And also, go forth and be a Fintech. So some of you aspiring to be it or thinking about, continuing a career in it. So those are the kind of areas I'm going to touch on, and then we can kind of break for some questions after as well. So what is product management? So one of the things I really wanted to touch on is the fact that those of you that aren't in Fintech, you've got a great skill set. And I suppose talking a bit about my product management experience pre-banking. So back in 2008, I joined L'Oreal as a new media intern. There was no such thing as digital or product management. And I joined their professional hair care brand. I had a shaven head and no beard, so very different from today. And I was there to work on the website, which was promoting to hairdressers about professional hair products. So I suppose it kind of was my kind of first stint. When I was at university, there was no such thing as a product manager. It just didn't exist. You kind of wanted to go into IT, we wanted to go into marketing. There was no such thing as a product manager, but that was my earliest stint into it. So my job there as an intern was converting offline marketing material. So some of you go to hairdressers or fancy barbers, they somehow have the materials of the kind of models and hair shots. My job was, how do I convert that online? How do I get people to engage with that? And I suppose early on, I recognised that the skill set of, actually converting, this piece of paper into online doesn't mean a copy and paste. It's a sort of language that you need to use for online. And also in terms of the imagery, wireframing, that type of stuff, and working with developers. So I was working at L'Oreal, so I worked with developers in Paris. But I suppose I was marketing to hairdressers, but I was also marketing to sort of people that are thinking about getting their hair done as well. So quite an interesting experience. And then I suppose my more formal kind of introduction into product management was at Sainsbury's. And I was the first ever product manager there. There was no such thing as product management. There was no such thing as agile development, feature teams that we all kind of are familiar with today. So I sort of spent my sort of bit of time in business analysis, project management, and I suppose I've always been a commercial person or a customer-led person. I fell into IT because I thought, it's quite interesting. I could use my sort of skills in terms of my business acumen. And I sort of naturally fell into that product management role. So I suppose I sort of learnt there that, you know, I needed to prove to this large organisation such as Sainsbury's that this thing called Agile, this thing called product management, it can actually work. You can do smaller bits of change. And I suppose I was sort of thrown in the deep end to an extent. I had 5 developers here in London and I had 5 developers over in India, and I had a business analyst, and it was kind of like, prove that this thing called product management and development works, because we're not convinced yet, but we think we want to go there. So I suppose the key things that I always would say to people that are thinking of going into banking, I had the same thing, or fintech, was, oh, you know, banking's this big thing, it's got this big sort of perception. I know when I was at university, banking was, you know, Goldman Sachs, investment banking and so on. It wasn't necessarily that kind of, you know, customer focused experience. But I think wherever you are today, or even if you're at another fintech and you're thinking of moving into it, you know, take the experiences you have. I suppose the key learnings that I took away was just sort of leadership, you know, kind of bringing this team of people fairly new to the UK, new to kind of banking, but also new to product management and Agile, of kind of how do you take that leadership role as a product manager. Also kind of the commercial skills you pick up. So if you work in a non-banking role, you might be very commercial, you might kind of focus on something which is there around how do you kind of drive the business, you know, how do you drive business costs down, or how do you increase revenue. You can take some of that skill set in terms of your product backlog prioritization, or sort of service. You know, banks haven't always been known for great service. Fintech has basically emerged because the products haven't really changed, but the way you serve, or the way people do banking, has massively changed. So if you're at a service-led company or something that hasn't got a history of banking, you can kind of really pick up from there. So I learned sort of things like, you know, branding, you know, the multi-channel experience of having stores, that kind of element of that. So I suppose wherever you are, you can kind of take those skill sets with you. And I suppose just building on that, you'll always have your product management toolkit. So that will be different for each of you. Some of you might say, I really like the tech side, really like getting deep into development. I really like understanding about APIs and so on. And some of you might be, actually, no, I'm quite commercially led, or I really like user experience, I like design. So you think about that, whether it's the furniture you sat on or the way you walked in today. I always look at this roof, actually, and think they've made it quite cool. Like, if you're intrigued by that, you know, how can you apply some of that design thinking? But I suppose the PM toolkit, which you can take with you everywhere, and it doesn't matter if you're a product manager in fintech, product manager in beauty, or product manager in e-commerce, you can always take your PM toolkit with you. So what is backlog prioritization? What is, you know, how do I write a user story? What's acceptance criteria? How do you engage with stakeholders? So, you know, what's your style? How do you kind of make sure you keep your teams engaged and going? So I suppose that PM toolkit that you develop, you should take with you everywhere. I should have put this slide up on the previous one, but this is kind of a feel of it. So, you know, the idea of Kanban, Agile, that thing, you know, I sort of read it. I was in real fear that when I was moving from sort of e-commerce into banking, that I was going into this big machine that was going to move as fast as Google and Apple, that I was like, let me read Agile for Dummies, even though I've been doing it for 2 years. And sometimes that book, those acumens and some of those things around Kanban and Agile, it's always good to refresh yourself on it. I know in my organisation we've switched methodologies, but some of this stuff you can always take along with you. So what is, you know, the other thing is user-led design. So I think, you know, with fintech, sort of going on to my point, it's very easy to kind of get caught up in banking and sometimes forget about the user. And I think we do that in all sorts of product management, whether you're in e-commerce or not. You kind of sat in a room with the same 5 people that you're always sat with, and particularly with finance, there's a big bubble out in the Docklands where people go to work and they queue up for the tube and they get onto this sort of silver line where no one else does that in London. And I suppose sometimes I feel like that's a pro and a con us all being in London. I always sort of say, let's do user testing, but let's get out of London. Because if you look at the average wage in the UK, compare that to London, or just compare how we are as individuals, it's very different. So I think there's sometimes this thing around product management where you've got to remind yourself that why are you building these products? It's usually for the user. Now that user might be someone in John Lewis who's a staff member trying to help people pick stuff, or it could be someone who's trying to get a mortgage with you. So I suppose always think about that user-led design. So it's kind of thinking, what's the problem I'm trying to solve? What do customers want? And I know that's kind of simple and might be like, right, I know that's common sense, but if you're kind of 12 months down the line and you've built an app and you've gone, right, we've done payments, we've done transfers, we've done statements. Oh, what else do people want? Oh, let's like move that button up because people might click it more. It's kind of easy to get lost in, we think people want this. So just always get into that cycle. So this is called the double diamond, but essentially it's kind of, discovery, define, develop, deliver, and you're constantly going along this. We don't spend enough, I think it's quite easy to kind of jump research and just go into build all the time. You're like, I've got this rough idea, let's just start building it. And then you kind of go back. So I've kind of taken a few new ways of, there's some quick win projects, but in the background, engage with UX, UI, think about some of the bigger things. So we're doing an app redesign at the moment, and I could have really dived in pretty quickly and gone there, just merge payments and transfers, or make this, move international payments higher. But you need to kind of think back and go, actually, what do users want? What do they use? Do that research. You can do card sorting. So I've always found it fascinating learning more and more about UX and UI, because I think whoever you meet, sometimes you work with designers that are from an agency, who've worked with councils, who've worked in fashion brands, or you kind of get a different perspective each time. Just building on it, so a little shout out to us here, but service-led design, so that's really important with every sort of business and every sort of product. But I always sort of emphasize in fintech and banking as such, it's absolutely imperative that you focus on that. So service-led design is essentially, we talked about the user experience, and essentially we touched on user-led design. Service-led design is how do all the other functions in your organization ensure that your product's supported well. So let's say I'm launching something in the app, or launching a new digital proposition, how do I ensure sort of operations and so on can support that, or that when the customer's handed off to another channel, or even if they're raising queries through the app, how can I make sure that we're also service-led? So the big thing with fintechs, I think we all have reviews. We'll go on Trustpilot, we'll go on TripAdvisor, we'll go on Money Supermarket and go, which one's the best mortgage and so on. Well, with fintech, it's actually regulated now. So the competition market authority go out every 6 months, not once a year, every 6 months they go out and they say, who's the best current account? And so not only are you kind of accountable to your customers, but it's actually published. So this isn't an internal report. This is actually printed and put on in every single bank. So next time you go into your bank, which might not be anytime soon, it might be fairly soon, you might be around the corner now, this will literally be printed in every bank branch. So not only as a fintech am I accountable for pleasing my customers, I'm also accountable for this list here. So most recently, we got top for overall service quality, so that was the number one. I've got a bit more work to do here in terms of online banking services, so about 2% here. But you can kind of see here, it's just absolutely important. So thankfully, 17 customers, 83 customers really recommend us. You kind of be low, this table goes all the way down to 16th. So I suppose that's the other thing with fintech, which I'm going to touch on, is the regulation element of it. So I suppose that's a vague thing. There's lots of things to fintech, and I suppose fintech is ultimately, in my mind, it's helping people manage their money, it's helping people reach their life ambitions. So whether that's a mortgage, whether that's paying for a present, whether that's traveling, whether that's insuring your car, there's lots of different, that's the product side of it, that's the experience side of it. So fintech, ultimately for me, is kind of, it's from your phone to your sort of online banking and so on, but it's things like APIs, it's open banking. And I think ultimately the big thing that fintech, I suppose the reason it's grown so big is that traditionally banking hasn't been great at meeting its customers' needs. It's 300 years old, there's a long way to go. Digital has really helped do that, and you can be really part of that. I'm going to go on to a little bit of that. I suppose the other thing that it's quite easy to think of the UK. The UK market's amazing in terms of fintech. You walk around the corner, you've got Silicon Valley and so on, but it's literally in different continents. So this is Kenya, where fintech is literally changing sort of the way people bank. In this country, you get a bank account maybe when you're 16, you might get it when you're 12, and that's quite normal. You kind of go to university, if you do, you get a graduate account and so on. And you've got a desktop, like everyone had a desktop. Some people might have never seen a desktop. But here, in a continent and a country where a lot of people don't have bank accounts, they have probably 3 phones or 4 phones. So they're able to kind of jump and go straight to sort of mobile banking has allowed payments to happen. So, the main thing is Kenya's M-Pesa mobile money service now works with China's WeChat Pay. So imagine that you didn't have a bank you just never had a bank in the UK, and then the first thing you do is you have your bank is on your phone, that's how you make payments, and then it's integrated with WhatsApp. So imagine that was your first experience. So I always think that there's a fintech bubble which is on your phone, but there's a massive piece here. So I went to Cape Town recently, and going to market stalls, or even sort of less sort of developed areas, it's like, oh, sorry, I haven't got any cash on me. Here's a QR code. It really enables the economies to develop. So that's also fintech beyond just the banks. Has everyone heard of open banking? Right. Has anyone like linked in another bank to their bank account? How many? A couple? Okay. So this is very cool, and I think you'll keep hearing about this, particularly in the fintech community. So ultimately, you would, for those that don't know, essentially you had consumers and you had banks, and they would talk to each other. And I suppose banks kind of owned an element of your data and how that was passed around, and you chose to pay, it would always be through your bank. Well, as open banking, it's really delivered a huge opportunity so that even yourselves today, if you wanted to go away and create something, you could kind of link into an API that then links into a bank. You could kind of choose to integrate other services. So, we've all got banking apps. Imagine if you just logged into one that told you everything, and you could make payments across different banks. So it's a real opportunity for fintech. So that's why I suppose a lot of traditional banks are quite scared, because the fact is that at the moment, you go into one bank account and you log in every day. Imagine if there was a company that was created that had a much better user experience, which meant no one ever came to your app, no one ever came to your service, they just went through another particular service to get there. So I think there's a huge opportunity there, and it's also the fact that, when I go back, people talk about banking being regulated for the right reasons, but this is literally regulation driving innovation. So I'm just going to touch a little bit more on that as well. So fintech is end-to-end change. Now you might say, well, what industry is an end-to-end change? But I suppose the thing I want to say to you is that in my time in Sainsbury's, the back-end system might mess up, but someone might still get their milk and bread through the door. If you got rotten bananas through the door, or your ASOS parcel was the wrong size, you're not too bothered about it. You might return it. You'd be a bit frustrated, but you're going to return it. However, with banking, if you get it wrong, it really does matter. Much more than that. So the bananas, fine, I'll go around the corner, I'll buy some new bananas. If you charge me wrong, or I don't quite get the mortgage that I wanted because of the data I've entered, or I'm literally there, say ASOS has gone, let's imagine ASOS has gone down and I've got a massive party to plan. Right, I'm there, I'm having to use the clothes that I've always had in my wardrobe, my ASOS parcel didn't come. But then when I'm there paying for dinner at that same party, my card is declined, and it's quite embarrassing. Like, I can't change that. So that was my sort of comparison of it. I suppose I like this picture because it is literally the backstage and the front stage. So the big thing about banks is that the more traditional banks have been around for over 300 years. So there is legacy systems later down the line. So the back end can be great, but sometimes it kind of slows you down. So with big banks, you've got to kind of consider, I think those are you going into fintech, depending on where you go. The front end is really easy to develop. You can kind of get releases out all the time. But the systems further down the stream, if you've got some of these big banks, like say NatWest, Halifax, and so on, they've got sort of 20 million customers. So you've got to be really careful in the back end. It might not be able to move as quick. So you might develop the front end very quickly in your 2-week sprint. But then the testing is going to take a lot longer, and the release might take a lot longer. But it depends where you go. I suppose with Metro Bank, where I am, it's a cleaner tech stack, so we've not been going as long, but you still have those challenges of making sure it's going right. And I suppose just building on that point, I always say the stakes are way too high. So what does that mean? So, we sort of saw last year, any TSB customers? On to there. Were you affected last year? Big time, right? Cool. So, I mean, that was literally an example of where, the service went down for a number of reasons. And off the back of that, it's kind of, TSB recovered, and, they're kind of doing okay now, but literally the chief executive left, customers were upset for weeks. People were, you imagine in that situation, you're about to either put a deposit down to rent a flat, or you're about to buy your house for your kids. God knows what else those customers are waiting for, but you can't afford to get things wrong. The stakes are just much higher. So it just sort of builds on finances are kind of giving people they're kind of giving them their lifestyle, or giving their family their lifestyle, or you're lending money and so on. So people are trying to go on holiday and they can't. So the stakes are just way too high that you absolutely need to kind of focus on making sure your service is as robust as possible. Cool. So I'm just going to go on to what being a good fintech project manager is. So what does that look like? So I suppose balance UX with risk. So, that's, you've got to apply now. So the thing with fintech is massively is regulations, and I suppose you're not selling someone something one-off. You're not selling them trainers, which they can return, and you're not selling them a sort of flight. You're not handing over to an API after you've done a comparison, for example. So I suppose the biggest challenge I find, and you'll find whichever stage in your career as a product manager, more so in fintech, is that you want to create really simple journeys. You want to get a really high conversion rate. You want to do that two-click process. But on the back of that, you want to also communicate things like the risks, the interest rate, what products you're getting, how do you get that interest rate at the end of the 12 months? We've all kind of put money into an account and gone, okay, right, can I withdraw or not? And I suppose there's elements of that where you absolutely have to get it right, because I suppose my big tip is you'll need to become good friends with your compliance department, with your legal and your risk departments. And it just takes time. I think you kind of build it up. You don't have the skill set from day one. So I think the big thing transitioning into fintech, or if you're still in fintech, is the fact that you will just get a bit more familiar with the do's and don'ts. And sometimes you won't get it right. You do need to rely on those functions. So I'd say really reach out there to your compliance functions, make some friends there. So I'm building on that. Just keep the journey simple. So does anyone invest? Invest in like funds, stocks, right? Has anyone heard robo advice? People like robo, you heard of that? Great. So ultimately, a lot of the fintechs, like I was saying, sell the same products. So a lot of these investment companies are advertising on the tube. If you go out, you'll notice they're everywhere. They're selling you an investment product at the end of it. But if you're ever down the pub or at a coffee shop and you go, hey man, I've just bought the RQSGX fund. What do you think of it? Have you heard of it? It's like, what's that? Well, this is the name. Advisor Inner Circle Fund 2, RQSI, GAA, Systematic Global Macro Fund, Institutional Class Shares. Oh yeah, I'll Google that later. This is how traditionally stocks, and funds have been listed. And it makes sense if you're in investments. You're like, oh yeah, that makes sense. You look that up on the Bloomberg terminal and so on. But ultimately, what fintechs are doing, and what you can do as a fintech PM, is just keep the journey simple. Don't worry about, is this finance? Does this make sense to a finance person? Just think about, if I was to speak to my parents or my brother or sister or about that, how could I explain that product? And that's where I'd say sort of some of the big robo-advice like Nutmeg or Money Farm or even Crowdcube, they've kind of made it quite simple for you to understand investments. I want to invest my money, I want to take low risk, and they're potentially giving you the same product or their own version of that product. But what they've done is they've made it really simple for the average person to be able to use it. So just think through, if you're going through a journey, yes, you use a testing, but how would you sell that to your parents, or how would you explain it to your parents or your little brother or your little sister? How would you explain what this RQSGX is? And sort of touching on this, so again, regulations versus innovation. Now, regulations obviously a key thing with banking, with fintech. It's about the reputation of banking was really hit in 2008. If you worked, that was my first year of work. I literally stopped picking up the Metro and Evening Standard because I was like, I want to stop reading about this. So I think these regulations have kicked in, and they've always been there, but they've become much more stronger and a lot more, they're there to protect you as a bank or you as a fintech, but they're also there to protect the customer. So, really helpful actually. The website's really engaging. I've worked with the FCA, I've worked with the Prudential Authority, and it's a two-way sort of stream. The relationships they're there in the key banking areas and so on. So I think really kind of, get an understanding that you don't need to do it before you join in a fintech. You'll just sort of naturally get that experience. But I'd say that there's regulation, but it's also driving innovation. So just touching on that. So literally the regulation. So Metro Bank, we won 120 million pounds from this RBS fund. So that money was made available to drive innovation, more competition in the small to medium enterprise banking space. So this is an example. So we won 120, Starling won 100 million, but overall there's 700-ish million available. And that's been made available to drive competition in fintech, in the banking space. And then all of the companies are pretty much going to match that either one-fold or two-fold. So imagine you're about to go into an industry which everyone's talking about is thriving, but there's actually funds being made available. So almost like 700 million here, match it with the others. £2 billion is going to be made available in the next couple of years to drive innovation in the small to medium enterprise business space. So it kind of shows you that, yes, regulation is there to protect you as a bank, but it's also driving innovation, driving competition. So you might want to grab a slice of that pie. You might want to kind of see how some of you might run your own businesses and you might benefit from this as well. Cool. So I suppose why am I sort of shouting about fintech? Why do I think you should go forth and fintech? So there's lots of opportunities. So I've touched on a lot of those, but Metro Bank was the first bank in 100 years in 2010, but there's thousands of banks popping up. I think everyone's heard of Monzo, Starling, Revolut in the UK, but internationally you've got things like BBVA. You've got the actual big banks spinning up their own little banks as well, because that's the fact that there's just so much opportunity here. I think people sort of say banking isn't disrupted yet. So 90% plus of customers are still with their bank. So who's moved house in the last 5 years, or moved maybe rental place in the last 5 years, right? Okay, cool. Who's moved bank account, like your main bank account that you pay salary in, right? Okay. So I suppose that's always the stat, that people move house more often than they move bank account. And that's what's key, is that there's still so many people still with their original bank. And as much as I think the thing that I always say is, get out of London, because here you can name those banks that are across the road and people know what they are. But if you go to Wales or Scotland, or my parents were up in Wales, if I go up to speak to them, they wouldn't have heard of all the stuff that's going on out here. So there's a long way to go. And similar to the open banking piece, I always say it's a great opportunity, and I think we're all kind of thinking about what it means for people, but a lot of people still aren't there with banking, aren't actually engaged with open banking. They don't really understand what it means just yet. So that's just a flavour of some of the banks. So I'm sure we've all used these. I know being on holiday, and if you didn't have a Revolut card, it was like, oh, you're the odd one out, and so on. So these are all the ones that are sort of popping up. So, and a lot of these got the funding that I just mentioned as well. Use your network. I suppose before I moved into fintech or banking, I sort of reached out to people. Go onto LinkedIn. You're in a great space here, so you're in product school tonight. Speak to the person next to you, or just go to the events. There's so many events around fintech, but there's also UI design. I love going to sort of more design-led events. So accessibility, for example, how do you kind of cater towards people that are unbanked? So how do you make your websites accessible? How do you make your mobile app accessible? Like that type of stuff is just really interesting, just getting a different perspective. Because I think the last event I went to here, one of the sort of PMs was like, they asked people when they come for an interview, what do you do 5 till 9, as in 5 p.m. to 9 p.m. And that doesn't mean you have to go to an event every night, but it's kind of like, how do you think out of the box? Because you're the product manager, you're the architect, you're the person setting the roadmap out. So if you're not keeping up to speed with what's going on out in the market, or out in terms of design and so on, what's the latest thing, then who else is doing that? So I think that's what I really love about product management, is that you never sort of benchmark at your job. You're constantly learning. So you might go, oh, I am so good at, I know everything about Apple, I know everything about iOS, I know all the design languages by Google, and all of a sudden, boom, they've released the iPhone X. Hold on, what? It doesn't have a back button. Where's the button gone? Oh, what? There's Face ID. What's that? So it's always changing, because the technology's changing. You have to change with it. So it never really stops in terms of the technology, but also UI, UX, and your customers are changing as well. So people didn't like push notifications. Now people love getting an alert every time they pay for something. They just love it, even though they're there and they're paying with their card. They still want to see another notification come up. So I think that's really fascinating. But in terms of using your network, I know I sort of reached out to people that I went to university with, or reached out to people that worked at banks or fintechs and just said, hey, what's it like? You know, is it hard work? Is it long hours? Do you have to wear a suit? Do you have to wear a tie? You know, what's it like on a Friday? All that, you know, what is it actually like to work in banking? The answer is it's pretty similar as a product manager to other industries. So I found that out. You might get a different perspective who you speak to. And finally, take your time. So banking's 300, 400, 500, thousands of years old, right? But ultimately, fintech isn't that old. Like, yes, there were computers in banks, and that could be called fintech. But the kind of bubble of the mobile apps, you know, some of us didn't have mobile apps growing up. Some of you might have used, but now you've got like 6 or 7 mobile apps that you've had over the last couple of years. And also, you know, there's a lot to learn. You might go to a massive bank where there's just the floor for credit cards, and there's 20 product managers for mortgages. Or you might go to a bank where you go, oh wow, I'm the product manager for the whole of the mobile app, or I'm the product manager for all payments. So just take your time as you would with any organisation. But if you're brand new to fintech and you're kind of getting your head around regulation, the tech and so on, it does take time. Cool, that's what is a product manager in fintech. So cool, thank you. So yeah, I thought we'd leave, so we've got a bit of time for questions, so we can just sort of go fire away, I suppose. First one's always a while. Right, do you want to go?
Where do you think the kind of next innovation is in terms of mobile banking apps? It's obviously kind of a big step forward in taking existing products and putting them in a mobile app. And what's coming next? So I obviously know that open banking is bringing a lot of integration of data, but are you seeing anything, I guess, more from a design or a functionality perspective?
So I suppose the way I think about it is probably, I think the technology will always help, but I'll stand up sometimes and say, oh, mobile, I didn't mention it now, but mobile banking is great. People log in every day, right? And you kind of ask why they're logging in every day. And it is because they're managing finances. It's because they need to find something out. It's not easily available. So for myself, I feel like there was this big thing of, right, everyone's on my mobile app, everyone's logging in every day, isn't that amazing? But I think for me, the innovation is how do you get people to log in less? So how do you give contextual information at the right time? So we've launched a AI-powered money management tool, but lots of people have done sort of timely notifications. So I shouldn't need to log into my app to find out, and my balance is going to be lower than my outgoings. I want you to tell me. And for example, if I'm a business, which some of you might be in, particularly startups, so like, I really need this invoice to come in, and I'm checking and refreshing my app every 5 minutes. How can you kind of let me know that as soon as that invoice comes in, great, I'm good to go, I can pay my staff, or I can move on to their next project. So I think for me, there's like a design-led piece where people are interacting and becoming more financially aware, but banks are now, and fintechs are basically making sure that people are more financially illiterate and just understanding more about their money. So my sort of big challenge in the next phase is like, how do we get people logging in less and sort of do more for them? And I think it's starting already. The other banks have really sort of particularly the challenger banks have really kicked that off. And I suppose it's just more of that. And then other things that you could move to is kind of, which I don't think the UK market's ready for, but there's some trials and some banks that are doing it in the States, which is kind of some of that automation. So I'm not quite comfortable with it just yet myself. I don't think the UK market is either, but you can see I could probably save £100 a month, but I'm not doing it for a number of reasons. But let's say you have an algorithm, or you sort of give consent and you kind of see over 6 months, oh right, yeah, I have got £100 left. How could we help people in an automated way potentially to save, or to like build up their credit score, for example? So people that don't have a good credit score, it's still kind of a myth. I'll be going for a mortgage soon. I'm still scared. It's that thing of, it's that unknown, like, oh, am I going to get it? So how can technology help automate some of that, or just make people more financially aware as well? Yeah, cool. Yeah, go for it.
You had a slide of the front stage and backstage.
Yeah.
So when you joined Metrobank, how was the, let's say, the release process for the backend? And when you came in, did you like help to make it more efficient?
Okay. So I suppose what I I suppose my initial piece was how, what's the state of the release? How many apps, how many sort of releases are we getting out? A month or a year and so on. So I think my initial thing was, right, what's the backlog look like? What are the features that are ready? What do customers want? And then I suppose throwing that challenge over and saying, right, how can we get, what does a release plan look like? How can we get more releases out? So I suppose as a product manager, people are looking to you, essentially. So I always sort of say the key thing is like being the cheerleader, being the enabler, making the coffees, getting the donuts on a Friday at the end of a sprint. I suppose my sort of key thing was how do I kind of enable, get the kind of momentum of the team up. The way I kind of helped with it was to kind of really challenge them in saying, right, here's my backlog, here's what I know customers are asking for. And you can do that through data, you can do that through technology, you can kind of take examples from other great tech stacks, right? So Amazon does a release every 2 seconds. I'm not saying banks have an aspiration to get to that point, but how can we get more release out? So I suppose I'd sort of encourage you to maybe, is to sit down and engage with everyone, get an understanding of the current environment, what are the blockers. So your testing environments will always be key. So how can you make your testing environments really clean? How can they mirror the actual real live customer streams the same? How can you kind of get them as close as possible? So when you go live with something, you're very confident with it. And I know that makes sense, I know it's common sense, but it can get neglected. So sometimes testing is the last thing that people are going, oh, we need more time to develop. Okay, testers, can you work on the weekend? That's not the answer. It's kind of like making sure the end-to-end, so the architecture, the testing, the analysis, and I suppose the environments are great. So I suppose that's one thing, make sure that kind of tech stack looks good. But I suppose last year, we were kind of going at about a release a month. I suppose what I'm trying to work towards is doing a back-end release every sort of four weeks and doing a front end every 4 weeks. So you're kind of overlapping. So you're initially doing a release every 2 weeks. So that might not sound great for certain organizations. It might sound great for other organizations. So I think there's that element of it as well. You might want to figure that out. I also feel working with the wider organization. So some digital departments in banks, there's 400, 500 people in the digital department, but there's only 12 months in the year and 12 releases. So you've got to make hard decisions of 50 product managers have got 50 things they want to get in. We can probably fit 30 in, and you've got to kind of really chunk down and go, what's right for customers, what isn't going to affect the tech stack much. So I've given you like everything there, but there's not kind of one magic bullet, really.
Following on this, how do challenger banks have their release process? Do they have like continuous deployment, or do they also have like monthly, weekly releases?
So it really varies. So I suppose some banks will have a weekly release process. I suppose what we have and what a lot of organizations do, you have your beta group or your like test group. So with the app stores, so iOS and Google Play Store, Apple app stores, you can kind of do an alpha release and a beta release. And you can choose if you want colleagues on that or you want customers on that. So those type of releases you can do as often as you like, in theory, and get them out to a closed group. Most banks bigger banks will likely do probably a release once a month. The more challenger banks might do a release once a week. But it really depends. The bigger banks will do something like, right, we've delivered open banking, and it's this big chunky thing. Well, as a challenger bank might be like, we've made it easy for you to set a goal for savings, for example. So it really varies on what you're trying to deliver. So you could do, I did a release last night, really small release up to our content system. It took half an hour. We organised that within 2-3 days. But then something like a bigger release, like launching the sort of AI-powered money management tool we have called Insights, that took a long time to test through, and then that took about 2 or 3 releases. But the key thing is, when you go into businesses, and you're probably all familiar with this, there's this your stakeholders will say, I want international payments by September. Like, that's when it needs to be available. You need to be able to challenge back and break that down to be like, you don't need to deliver everything in one go. You can put your back end in first, and then your front end. You can do a hot fix. So it might take you 3 or 4 releases, but just chunk it down. Because particularly for large organizations where they're going, we've got 12 releases this year, they're going to try and fit in as much as possible into that release. But the way you can ease it off for your development teams is just say, let's do one back end release. Maybe let's go live with, international payments, maybe let's just do US dollars first, and then let's build on top of that. So it really does depend on what type of product you're building, what type of bank you're at, and so on. But those are kind of my key takeaways from sort of being able to get your cadence higher. Yeah. Cool. Okay. Sorry, I've got one in the back. I'll come back to you.
Sorry, is everyone in the team in-house, or is there external teams as well?
So it's a mixture. I suppose it's a mixture. I think so I suppose my experiences are, I've been in an organisation where I was speaking to India in the morning, Manchester in the midday, and then Dallas in the evening. So if you join quite a large bank, you can kind of work across the board, and that kind of helps. It's a positive in a way. You've got an army of testers, you've got development teams all around the world, working all around the clock, and if you want to really get a product out quickly. But I suppose where I am now, we're all nicely co-located. So we've got feature team banks. So I have my UX and UI behind me. I have my business analyst and product and Scrum master next to me, and I've got my developers on site as well. So I've got 2 feature teams on mobile. I've got another 3 feature teams just on the side as well. So we're all co-located. I think you'll.
In Metro, there's not like external consultant.
Yeah, so there's a mixture. So we work with partners. So I think if you work in technology, you work in digital, you end up kind of working across things. So I think it's always good to blend. You know, if you can have a full team in-house, great for you. But I don't necessarily have a preference. I think so the technology and the skill sets you have as product managers or developers, analysts, it's so in demand that we do work with partners. So it might be that I have a large research piece that I want to do. I can't get my UX and UI person to recruit 20 people, physically pay them £50 to come in and so on. So it makes sense to outsource it. Or I might need a pen tester. So I might need a security consultant to come in, have a go at the app, make sure it's secure. And I don't need that every day, but I need it every time I do a release. So it's a mixture of stuff. So yeah. Great. Should we next? Yeah, right.
Yeah, sorry. You touched earlier on the importance of getting feedback directly from the customers when you go into branches. With particularly a lot of the large banks closing their branches down and outside in rural areas in particular, and also recognising the new players coming in and going straight into the online view, how will you go about keeping up the pace of growth in the market to make sure that you get over the tipping point?
So when you say tipping point, do you mean the stores, or do you mean the general growth?
So really, customer growth, I guess, digitally engaged customer growth. Okay,
so I suppose what I find is that when we open a store, and we're still opening stores, as part of that fund, we're opening stores more in the north. Some of that, we open a store, it has a real blitz and real engagement. So if you've seen some Metro Bank store openings, anyone been to one? No? They're pretty crazy. You've got stilts, you've got jugglers and so on. So there's a real buzz around that. And what I find is I can look at web analytics, and I can say, for example, we opened a store in Bristol, and then I can sort of see demographically, I can't see much more than that. All of a sudden we've got X amount of thousand users in Bristol. So that kind of drives its buzz. So I think there's an element of, there's sort of, Metro Bank, we offer the best of both. So you can come into store 7 days a week, but you can log online as well. I think with the other banks, I think their challenge, so the digital only banks, they don't have the overheads maybe of running a store, they don't have that service, but I suppose their challenge is the perception, their kind of, how do they build trust? How do they kind of get engaged a wider demographic? So I know that, it doesn't matter what age you are, you will engage with certain channels. So some people use online banking, don't use mobile banking. And I think there's that element of trust. So going back to the people that put their hands up of they haven't moved bank in X amount of years, I think that's the big challenge maybe for the digital only banks, is that they haven't got, some of us just need to go into a physical presence. Sometimes getting a mortgage isn't that straightforward. Sometimes you need to get cash out. Think of small businesses. You think about the market traders in Borough Market on a Saturday, Spitalfields. What do they do with their cash? Where do they take that? So I think there's some answers. So partnering up with the post office and so on. So I think that's always a challenge, that you've got this amazing digital app and then you're sending people into the post office. So that works though, right? So I think there's an element of, there's pros and cons to both. But I think for me, the digital growth is kind of coming from having a great experience. People aren't quite at the point of Google searching the Apple Store to be like, what's the best app? I do think that could happen in the future, but then they sometimes do want to just pick up the phone and get a mortgage or get advice, or I don't recognise this payment, how do they do that? Yeah. Okay, cool. Go for it.
What would you say would be a typical profile for a product manager at Metro Bank? Are they more technical savvy or more commercial focused? And second question, how do you go about planning your roadmap for the year? How far up in advance do you
Yeah. Okay. So there's a mixture of us. So if I'll talk about the team at a high level, I'm kind of, I suppose I've got kind of a bit more of a varied background. So I've worked in sort of wealth and investment side of retail. I've worked in sort of e-commerce, beauty, and so on. And then right now I have quite a broad. So my sort of, I'm naturally commercially led. So I guess growing up in business and parents had a business and so on. So I'm always naturally commercially led. But as I'm developing, I'm becoming more UX, UI led and design focused, because I think there's an element of, there's some people at the bank that will run the mortgages, run the credit cards, the rates and the commercial model, and my job is to make that as smooth as possible. So that's me. We've got a couple of other product managers that come from, I suppose, more of a different type of background. So they might have come from a kind of consultancy type background, so they've worked at lots of different places. And then we've got a few sort of banking product managers as well. But I think for me, that there's not necessarily, each product manager will have their own strengths. So if I was to hire a product manager now, I wouldn't necessarily say, oh, have they got 10 years of mobile experience? How well do they know iOS? I wouldn't say, how well do they know banking? Because the reason banking is hiring so many non-bankers, and this has been happening for the last 10 years, is because banking hasn't always been great at delivering great services. So hence why Metro Bank started in 2010. All these new banks are serving up because they want people from non-banking backgrounds. So you'll find people from Spotify background, from, say, me, Sainsbury's background. You'll find people from all types of different areas going into it. So I wouldn't say I have like a defined thing of we've hired these Metro Bank POs for this reason. I think they've kind of hired just based on kind of, they've got the right attitude, they've got the customer focus. It's all about being quite customer focused and quite a can-do attitude. So even though Metro's a big, is a fairly established bank, it's floated, it's on the market and we've been going for a while, it still has that kind of startup-y, fintech-y buzz where, I haven't got an army of people. It's me very much defining the roadmap for mobile. And if I get it wrong, it's on me. If I get it right, it's on me. And I'm very much owning that destiny. So I think that's what I really like working at, say, a smaller bank / fintech. But the other side of that, if you want to work at a bigger bank, then you get the scale, right? So some of these banks have got 25 million customers that have been banking with them since 9 years old, and their granddad's banked with them. So they've got the scale there and the breadth. So if they do want to release a new product, it's quite easy to get out to people, but then they have a whole lot of responsibility to get that product right. Your second question, sorry, I missed that.
How do you go about finding roadmaps?
So I suppose you start off with a backlog. I think roadmaps are interesting, so I always get asked for roadmaps. So your stakeholders will say, what are you delivering in the next 12 months? When is it being delivered? But ultimately, I have backlog refinement every week. So I had it at 2 o'clock today for half an hour with my team going, okay, yeah, how complicated is that? Let's move that down and up. So I think you initially I think you should probably think, before the roadmap, think about what are you trying to achieve? What's your strategy for the year in terms of, I want to serve customers, I want to sell more products, or I want to get complaints down, or I want to just make it easy for people to talk to us. What is that problem you're solving? Then get into your roadmap and your backlogs. But I think you can kind of lay out your roadmap of, here's the features we're delivering for the year. And you can be really harsh and this is quite hard to get to. So I've had to do it before in places where I've gone, here's my budget, here's my team, here's a list of stuff that we want to deliver and we might get through it. So if a builder turned up to your house and you said, I want a 3-bedroom house in 6 months, and he went, okay, maybe, or we'll see where we get to. You wouldn't be that comfortable, but I think with mobile and fintech and stuff and technology, you can have that thing of, right, we're testing and learning. We'll see how long we can get through. Because you might deliver 5 or 6 great products, but don't get tied to like, we need that feature by this time. So I think for me, it's just focus on your backlog, focus on the issue the kind of customer needs you're trying to meet versus a roadmap and set deadlines. Yeah, cool. What else?
Sorry,
Yeah.
can I just
Yeah.
follow up on that?
Yeah.
Do your bosses in Metro Bank accept that position? That you may say, we'll try and get through this roadmap, but when you miss the deadlines as they perceive them,
Yeah, I mean, so I think it's an ongoing conversation. So I wouldn't say it's ever like, stop, that's it, you're completely entrusted. I think you've got stakeholders, you've got kind of people that are giving you the budget. So I think there is that accountability, but I think it's just bringing them into your way of thinking, bring them into the Scrum. So for example, you can kind of have that conversation of, as I said, do a release every 4 weeks. So if I said to you, April, I think we're going to get it in April. Oh, sorry, we've missed the deadline, but do you know what, there's a release in 2 weeks? Or is the release 2 weeks after that? Or, right, we've delivered this phase of the project and it's in beta, customers are using it. So there's lots of different ways. I think that's the difference between shipping digital products. You don't necessarily have to wait another 6 months. So obviously the whole thing of product management, moving to Agile, Scrum, having these regular releases is that the old way of technology, which I don't hit away because it works for certain projects, it works for certain industries. So a supply chain system, you wouldn't go, let's change how that warehouse works one by one. You'd have to do a big bang. But with Agile, it is kind of a case of, right, if I'm not going to ship the product today, I might be able to ship it tomorrow. So I think there's that appreciation, but you'll obviously always have your challenges. So I think it's just building that relationship with your stakeholders, taking them on that journey of here's how digital works, here's how Agile works, have an appreciation for test and learn as well. So I think there's sort of that element of it as well. Yeah. Go for it.
Final question. You talked about kind of engaging with risk and compliance and kind of all those teams that traditionally don't operate in an agile way. Do you kind of feel overly constrained by some of the things that those guys sort of require you to do? And does that relationship work well?
So it kind of, I suppose, it really depends where you are again, but I think in sort of a role where I was mainly focusing on investments, then it was a very regular relationship of compliance and kind of making sure we're checking in every time we did an update. In a more retail role, it's, I think it's kind of drawing on those experts when you need to, I suppose. Sometimes you won't need them every time, so changing kind of the front end of the app doesn't necessarily require you to kind of necessarily go, all right, we're changing it from red, blue and white to so and so, or we're going to move the kind of position of this or the flow of the journey necessarily. But sometimes if you're launching a product, something around tax or something that's a bit riskier, that's when you need to kind of delve on it. So I think it comes over time. So there is this notion of get compliance in your sprint, right? Get the right people in your stand-up, and that might work for you. So if you're doing a product launch, and I've done this before, where you do a sort of design sprint and keep them involved in it. So there's very different sort of techniques that you can do. So I think involve them in the sprint, engage them as is, but also just spend some time with them before you need it. So particularly in fintech and big banks, people generally in compliance, risk and legal are used to signing off, we're about to offer this fund, or we're about to launch this massive mortgage. They might not necessarily understand what Apple Pay is or what a push notification is. I know that sounds, it's going back to that thing of think about the industry that banking is. It hasn't always been technology driven. People won't necessarily be familiar with push notifications and so on. So take them through your app, take them through your journey before you need them for something. Get them familiar with the platform because they're working on several different things at once. They might be dealing with a regulator. They might be dealing with a customer issue or marketing thing, but then you're going, hey, this big shiny thing, open banking, here's the journey, can you sign off? And they just don't, it's like give them that space like you would anyone else. Yeah. Go for it.
You mentioned from the way you speak, it sounds like test and learn is key, and working with users is also key. How often do you guys carry out some sort of testing with your target users? That's my first question. And is it usually done during the discovery phase or post-development?
Yeah, so I say we do it pretty much every other week. So that can be a light test down into a store. It can be a test through a survey. It can be a paper-based test. So I always say to people, draw on a piece of paper what your design is, go and test that. So we test pretty much every other week, but then at the moment we're doing quite a strategic piece of work. That's going to be a bigger research piece. So it's going to be an element of recruiting, testing, and then I think the last piece of work I've done around an app redesign, we've kind of done 3 or 4 months worth of testing because it was such a big piece. So we were essentially testing every couple of weeks, different versions, different people. Yeah. And the second question was?
I suppose the question is, are you the decision maker on that as to whether that should take place or not? Is it the UX?
No, not necessarily. So
somebody else beyond?
So, I mean, I guess sometimes I might say, right, let's do some research, but really you should take the skill set of a UX and UI people. So we've got a researcher who's absolutely amazing and like has the expertise in that. So, you know, I'll be the product manager. I'll do backlog refinement. I'll do the user stories. I'll engage the teams. But in terms of research, so things like card sorting, recruiting people, asking the right questions. Yes, I might be able to do it, but I'm not the best person to do it necessarily. So I'll sit there, I'll support. So I think do rely on your team. So you've got designers, you've got business analysts to help you in those functions. And I think sometimes you can't be everywhere at once, right? You need to kind of delegate that out as well. Yeah, cool. Did you have, yeah, go for it.
It was kind of building on the response to the other gentleman in the pink shirt earlier, where you were talking about, you know, what excites you in the near future, and you were talking about automation, kind of money saving. So my question is, what's the most exciting product or feature or fintech brand that's currently live right now? What's the thing you wish, gosh, I wish I had woken up in the middle of the night and had that idea and got my team to build it?
That's a good question. Gosh.
It might be your app is so... nothing excites you.
I'm trying to think through. Joel, let me think that through. Okay. I'll try. Is there any more questions while I think that through? Sorry. Gosh, I
could ask you a related question.
Go for it.
Well, in terms of all industries, you kind of argue that Apple are the absolute maestros of product development and exciting users and creating desire. So for me, maybe the most exciting thing that's happening now in the retail banking space is Apple kind of launching.
Yeah.
So I was just wondering what your thoughts are on how that will ripple through into the UK.
Yes. Yeah, no, absolutely. So people always ask, oh, what if Google, what if Apple, and so on. And I think it's a fair point. But one of my colleagues made the point of there's probably ice cream men outside going, what if Amazon go into ice cream? What if Apple release an ice cream truck? We're all going to be, you know, all over the place. So I think that was funny because at that point when we were having that chat, they literally released the credit card. So it was quite funny. It was quite timely. So I think competition's always welcome. And I suppose the fact is that they have paired up with a bank. So the point I always make is that at the early start of fintech, it was like, we don't need banks. We're going to disrupt it. We're going to take your customers. Well, it's actually, no, you do need banks. So the fintechs and the Apples do still need a bank to an extent. So they've launched with Goldman Sachs. When they move over here, they'll need to launch potentially with a bank. So they've obviously offered they're offering a pretty innovative product. But underneath that will lie a bank, will lie that. So I think there's an interesting piece of they're not quite taking the full step foot. And there's a lot that comes with banking. So I think obviously starting a challenger bank, you know, you can sort of say, right, we can scale, we don't need to go full-fledged. But someone like Apple, who, when they're going to sell a credit card, they're not going to go, oh, we've got 100,000 customers in week 6, aren't we doing great? They're going to go, oh crap, we've got, 50 million people and we're taking on a lot of risk here. I think there's a long way away from them going, we're ready to become a bank and we understand how to run a bank, we understand how to do that risk. We're willing to basically, I don't know, let's say gamble their 100 billion in cash to launch a credit card. I don't think they're quite there. So I think they're going through the learnings and I think that's quite an interesting piece. I think it will disrupt the market. I think the US is much less competitive. It's very hard to launch new products there because you're state by state. The UK is much more of a hotbed to do it. Will they come here? I'm not too sure.
Yeah, my understanding is payments in the US are a little bit behind payments.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, interestingly, US was like massively ahead. They were really innovative when it came to payments, and I suppose they've fallen behind now. And we're kind of the innovator. I suppose going back to your point around the technology I'd launch, I do think like contactless payment has just changed things. So could I come up with that? So I just love, I suppose that element of it all. When you're lying in bed and you want to make that purchase and you're like, oh, the wallet's in the bedroom, just being able to kind of click, actually I'm going to pay by Google Pay or Apple Pay, or I'm going to pay by Amazon Pay. I know it doesn't sound like the most innovative technology, but if you kind of look back to like how much of a change that's been, I know it's not the most exciting thing, but that's what I find is really exciting. Yeah. Anyone else? Is that cool? Okay, go for it.
One more question if there's time.
No, go for it.
So obviously we were discussing about how you reach out to users, discover their pain points, their jobs, their work proposition to resolve those. But there's sometimes those things in products where your users might go, oh my God, I never never knew I needed that.
Yeah.
Where does that innovation, do you think, where does that come from within your team? Was it, how does those things spring up?
Yeah. So I think there's an element of luck, but there's an element of creating your own luck. So when I've done user testing for something else, we've been kind of doing user testing for a particular new feature, and then the person's mentioned something else. They've gone, oh, wouldn't it be great? So sometimes, like, you know, you're looking for something really specific feedback on like your latest app release, but then they'll mention something else. So like, be out there exploring stuff. I think Twitter, I love Twitter. I just love scrolling through, you know, like what are the kind of ideas that someone have. So like the sort of the black hole thing in the last couple of days, you know, that was kind of discovered by someone, and that's the first ever innovation, right? So how did they use that technology and so on as well? So I think there's always new technology popping up, but I do think actively kind of looking for it. I think putting yourself in the position of listening to users. Sometimes my sort of UX UI guys are really punchy, so they'll be like, what's the point in banking? Why do we have all these, like, why do we have 10 accounts? Why can't we have one account? Why can't we have one card? Or, you know, why do we need to do, and sometimes you can kind of shut that down in your head and be like, oh no, but regulatory this, or people wouldn't understand if you had one account, because where would savings go? But sometimes some of that stuff, so giving your UXs, UI the space, so some of the things that always comes up in a retro, so I do end of year retrospectives with my team, and I do retrospectives every sort of week, but some of the things that developers want, so I find that innovation comes from developers because they can kind of see problem areas and really good problem solvers and really innovative. Sometimes sort of having workshops with them going, I always sort of say, hey, what feature would you like to see in the app? So use that audience around you. It's not always on you. So take that kind of pressure that's on yourself to like come up with an amazing product and put that back out to the users, to your team, and even just reach out to other people. Like, so there's definitely problems in banking that have probably been solved elsewhere. So I suppose, you know, look to other industries, because and vice versa, there's problems that, you know, might be in e-commerce that have been solved elsewhere as well. So I think look into other industries as well. Yeah. Okay. Cool. All right. Thanks all. Thank you.